September 1962, Capitol Records Tower, Hollywood. A 21-year-old named Brian Wilson sits in a waiting room with his two brothers, a cousin, and a neighbor. They've been waiting for 3 hours. They're wearing matching striped shirts their mother made. They look like a high school doo-wop group that took a wrong turn. Capitol Records doesn't want to see them. The label has already passed on them once. So has every other major label in Los Angeles. Their previous single, released on a tiny independent label that's now functionally bankrupt, sold barely 300 copies outside their neighborhood. But Brian Wilson has something in his pocket, a second chance, earned through sheer persistence and one unexpected stroke of luck. A regional hit that crawled up the charts in Phoenix and Sacramento. Not enough to matter, just enough to get back in the room. The problem is simple. The sound they're selling, California surf music, doesn't exist yet as a commercial category. Dick Dale is still playing beach parties, Jan and Dean haven't crossed over, and rock and roll in the autumn of 1962 is in freefall. The twist era is over. Elvis is making movies. Buddy Holly is dead. The industry is retreating to safe, orchestrated pop. And 5 kids from Hawthorne, California think the next big thing is singing about waves. Rewind 18 months. The Wilson family lives in a small house on 119th Street in Hawthorne, a working-class suburb wedged between the beach cities and Los Angeles. Murray Wilson, the father, is a semi-successful songwriter and machinery salesman with volatile moods and a hearing aid he refuses to acknowledge. His sons, Brian, Dennis, and Carl, grew up singing around the house. 4-part harmonies learned from their mother, Audrey. The tight, interlocking vocal style that would define them was forged in a living room before any of them understood what they were building. Dennis Wilson is the only one who actually surfs. His brothers don't. But Dennis keeps coming home with stories about the parties, the girls, the culture forming around the beaches. A youth movement with no soundtrack yet. In the summer of 1961, Brian writes a song called Surfin'. In about 15 minutes, basic chord progression, lyrics that barely make sense, but the melody has something, a brightness, an innocence that feels new. They record it in the Wilsons' family garage on a cheap tape machine. Murray takes the tape to a small label called Candix Records. The song gets pressed as a single under the name The Beach Boys, a name Candix invents, not the band. Surfin' becomes a regional hit in Southern California. It peaks at number 75 on the Billboard Hot 100 in early 1962. 75. Barely a blip. But for Brian Wilson, it's proof of concept. The sound works. The hunger is real. And if they can get into a real studio with real distribution, they can do this. There's just one problem. Candix Records is collapsing. The tiny advance they received is gone. They have no contract, no representation, and no obvious path forward. Murray Wilson decides to become their manager. He's overbearing, aggressive, and believes his sons are destined for stardom. He's also their only advocate. He calls every label in Los Angeles. Most won't take meetings. Capitol Records says no. Then, because Surfin' won't stop climbing in scattered markets, Capitol reconsiders. 1 album, 1 shot. But there's a catch. They need 10 songs. Immediately. And Brian Wilson has never written an album before. Spring 1962. Western Recorders, Studio 3. Capitol assigns them a young engineer named Chuck Britz and minimal studio time. The budget is small, the expectations are smaller. Brian Wilson is 19 years old. He's never produced a recording session in a professional studio. His father, who has convinced Capitol to let him co-produce, sits in the control booth interjecting, criticizing, pushing. The tension between father and son is immediate. Murray wants polish, show business professionalism, enunciation. He hears his sons as a vocal group that happens to play instruments. Brian hears something different. He wants the vocals bright, stacked, almost floating. He wants the instruments louder than vocalists usually allow. He's chasing a feeling, not a format. But he doesn't have the language yet to defend his instincts. And Murray Wilson is the adult in the room. The first problem, they don't have enough material. Surfin Safari and 409, a car song Brian and Mike Love co-wrote, are strong. But the rest of the album is filler, covers, and half-formed sketches. They record versions of Summertime Blues and Moondog because they need to fill space. They sound competent. They don't sound essential. The second problem, Brian's voice keeps cracking. He's singing too high, pushing too hard, trying to match the falsetto he hears in his head. His father tells him to sing lower, safer. Brian refuses, then complies, then refuses again. Carl Wilson, only 15, plays guitar on the sessions. He's the most technically skilled musician in the group, but he barely speaks. Dennis, the drummer, is inconsistent, sloppy on some takes, electric on others. Mike Love, their cousin, sings lead with confidence, but he's already clashing with Brian over creative control. There's no unity yet, no shared vision. Just 5 people in a room trying to sound like something that doesn't exist. The central conflict in those early sessions isn't musical, it's generational. Murray Wilson wants his sons to succeed within the industry as it exists. That means sounding professional, polished, ready for radio. He pushes for cleaner takes, fewer risks, safer arrangements. Brian Wilson wants to break something open. He can hear the finished record in his head. Layered, bright, almost naive in its enthusiasm. But he can't yet articulate why those instincts matter. There's a moment during the recording of Surfin Safari where Brian insists on doubling the vocal harmony in a way that Murray considers unnecessary. The argument escalates. Brian shuts down. The session stalls. Chuck Britz, the engineer, later recalled the dynamic as a son trying to prove himself while his father tried to protect him. But protection and control aren't always distinguishable. The compromise they reach isn't creative. It's logistical. Brian agrees to record the songs Murray's way, then quietly redo sections when his father isn't in the room. It's a pattern that will define their relationship for years. But there's another tension forming, quieter and more dangerous. Brian is starting to realize that he's better at this than anyone else in the room. Not better at playing. Not better at singing. Better at hearing the space between the instruments. Better at knowing what the song needs before it's finished. He doesn't have the authority to act on that knowledge yet. But the awareness is there. And it's creating distance. June 1962. Capitol Records tells Murray Wilson they need to make a decision. Either the album comes out in 3 months, timed for the tail end of summer, or it doesn't come out at all. The problem, the album isn't finished. Half the songs are weak. The production is inconsistent. And Capitol's marketing department isn't convinced surf music is even a genre. There's a meeting. Capitol wants to shelve the project. Murray Wilson refuses. He argues, cajoles, borderline begs. He reminds them that Surfin Safari, the lead single, is climbing in test markets. He promises the album will sell. He stakes his credibility, his son's futures on this. Capitol agrees to release it. Barely. But the concession comes with a condition. The album has to be cheap. No elaborate artwork. No promotional push. Standard distribution. If it fails, the Beach Boys are done. Brian Wilson turns 20 that June. He understands what's happening. This isn't an opportunity, it's a test. And failure doesn't mean trying again with another label. Failure means going back to Hawthorne, getting a job, letting go. He finishes the album in a blur of late-night sessions, last-minute overdubs, and compromises he'll regret for years. Some of the songs are good, some are adequate. A few are filler so obvious it's almost embarrassing. Surfin Safari and 409 stand out. Bright, energetic, undeniable. The rest of the album orbits around them, functional but unfinished. And then it's done. Mixed, mastered, pressed. All that's left is to see if anyone cares. October 1st, 1962. Surfin Safari, the album hits record stores. The initial response is confusion. Radio stations don't know where to place it. It's too fast for pop. too clean for rock and roll, too young for adult contemporary. Some DJs in California play it. Most don't. The album cover doesn't help. It's a low-budget photograph of the band on a woody station wagon, smiling like they're in a car commercial. No edge, no mystery. It looks like exactly what it is. 5 kids from the suburbs pretending to be cooler than they are. But something unexpected happens in scattered pockets across the country. The single Surfin Safari starts climbing. Not everywhere, not fast, but consistently. Phoenix, Sacramento, San Diego, markets with access to beaches, or at least the idea of beaches. The song peaks at number 14 on the Billboard Hot 100 in December. The follow-up single, 409, hits number 76. 14 isn't a smash, but it's real, and for a debut album that almost didn't happen, it's survival. The problem is that nobody, including Capitol Records, understands what they've captured. Critics dismiss it as a novelty, a regional fad. Surf music as a genre is treated like hula hoops or pogo sticks. Fun for now, gone by spring. Even within the band, there's uncertainty. Dennis Wilson, the only surfer, feels vindicated. Mike Love thinks they need to be tougher, more rebellious. Carl stays quiet. And Brian Wilson is already writing the next album in his head, trying to fix everything he got wrong the first time. The industry's take is clear. This is a fluke, and maybe they're right. By early 1963, the Beach Boys are touring constantly. High school gyms, small theaters, state fairs, they're not headliners. They're the opening act for whoever Capitol can pair them with. The grind is immediate and relentless. They drive between cities in a cramped van, sleeping in cheap motels, playing the same 8 songs every night. Murray Wilson manages the tour with the same aggressive intensity he brought to the studio, booking as many shows as possible, convinced that visibility equals success. Brian Wilson hates it. Not the music, the chaos, the lack of control, the impossibility of hearing himself think while living out of a suitcase. Dennis loves it. The girls, the parties, the validation. Mike thrives on stage. Carl adapts. Brian endures. But the larger consequence is more subtle. The album's modest success has locked them into an identity they didn't choose. Capitol wants more surf songs, more car songs, more of the same bright, innocent sound that almost nobody took seriously. Brian knows they need to evolve. But evolution requires space, and space requires leverage, and leverage requires hits. So he writes the next album, Surfin' USA, in a frantic 3-month blur, trying to build on what worked while burying what didn't. Surfin' USA, the single becomes their first top 5 hit in the spring of 1963. The album goes gold. Suddenly the Beach Boys aren't a fluke anymore, they're a phenomenon. But the foundation was Surfin' Safari, the risky, unfinished, almost didn't happen first album that no one believed in. And that gamble, taken in desperation, defended by a father who wouldn't let go, executed by a 19-year-old who didn't yet know what he was capable of, changed everything. For years, Surfin' Safari was treated as a footnote. The awkward first step before the Beach Boys became the Beach Boys. Critics in the 1960s barely noticed it. When they did, the tone was condescending. A novelty act. Kids singing about the beach. Nothing serious. By the 1970s, after Pet Sounds and the collapse and the myth-building, historians started looking back, and what they found was more interesting than anyone expected. Surfin' Safari wasn't just a debut album. It was a blueprint. The vocal arrangements, though primitive compared to what came later, already hinted at Brian Wilson's instinct for harmony. The brightness, the innocence, the refusal to sound cynical or detached, that was there from the beginning. Musicians started citing it as an influence, not because it was perfect, because it was fearless. Tom Petty later said that hearing Surfin' Safari as a kid in Florida made him realize you didn't need to be from the city to make music that mattered. The suburban perspective, the middle-class optimism, was radical in its own way. Brian Wilson himself has rarely spoken warmly about the album. In interviews, he's called it rushed and incomplete. He's right, but the incompleteness is part of what makes it compelling. You can hear 5 teenagers trying to figure it out in real time. The mistakes are audible. So is the hunger. The legacy of Surfin Safari isn't in the songs themselves. It's in what the album made possible. Without it, there's no Surfin USA. Without Surfin USA, there's no Pet Sounds. Without Pet Sounds, the entire trajectory of 1960s pop music shifts. But the influence runs deeper than that. Surfin Safari proved that regional, youth-driven subcultures could sustain a national sound. Surf music wasn't a fad. It was a movement waiting to be documented. Within 2 years, surf rock would dominate the charts. By 1964, Capitol Records was signing every surf band they could find. The genre exploded, fractured, and faded, but it existed because someone took the risk first. And that risk was taken by 5 kids who had no safety net, no plan B, and no reason to believe it would work. The songs from Surfin Safari still surface occasionally. Surfin Safari the single is a classic rock staple. 409 gets played at car shows. The rest of the album remains obscure. But the album's real legacy is structural. It taught Brian Wilson that he could hear things other people couldn't. And once he learned that, there was no stopping him. Surfin Safari matters because it almost didn't happen. The odds were stacked against it. The industry didn't want it. The budget was minimal. The band was unproven. The sound was unfinished. And yet, it survived. Not because it was perfect, because someone believed in it enough to force it into existence. That's the lesson here. Not every great career starts with a masterpiece. Sometimes it starts with something awkward, incomplete, and desperate, something that only looks inevitable in hindsight. Brian Wilson was 19 when he made this album. He didn't know he was about to change music. He was just trying not to fail. The distance between those two things, desperation and destiny, is shorter than we think.